And you're all invited to put up your headsets so you can hear us. Can we get a confirmation it works? Brilliant, fantastic. Welcome to this event on plastics, climate and innovation, which is brought to you by GRID-Arendal. My name is Richard Klein, I'm with the Stockholm Environment Institute, and I will be your moderator today. We'll be talking about, as the title says, plastics and its effect on climate, particularly focusing on the emissions of plastic production. During this event, we'll first hear a keynote presentation and followed by a panel discussion with three stakeholder perspectives, so to speak. One is a scientific perspective or an analytical perspective, one is a policy perspective, and one is a business perspective. We don't have much time, so I'm not going to take much longer other than to introduce our first speaker, who is Ieva, Rucevska, who is a principal expert at GRID-Arendal and also the organizer of this event. Ieva, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Richard, and I hope everybody hears me. So, yes, closer to the source, so to say. The unsustainable production and disposal of plastics have created a dual crisis of pollution and climate impacts affecting ecosystems and human health. Plastic pollution is an internationally recognized problem. However, less awareness is given to climate impacts of plastics across the life cycle, starting from the resource extraction and going to the waste management at the end of the life cycle. Nearly all plastics are derived from fossil fuels, such as crude oil, gas, and coal. Additionally, plastic production is an energy-intense process, requiring significant amount of electricity and heat. This also derives from fossil fuel. Currently, between 4% and 8% of oil production is used for making plastics, including both for sourcing out material, feedstocks, and energy required for the production process. This percentage is going to increase to 20% in next 25 years. The global production of primary plastics is estimated to have released about 2.24 gigatons of CO2 emissions in 2019, representing about 5.3% of global emissions. As this figure is the latest estimate based on calculation only on 9 main plastic polymers, which totally account for 80% of plastic production, it is certain that this estimate is very low. The life cycle starts with raw material extractions and goes at the end of the life cycle at the waste management process. If we want to see the reduction of greenhouse gases from plastics, the main measures should be targeted at the extraction phase, along with the petrochemical production and manufacturing of products. This stage is responsible for about 90% of all greenhouse gases deriving from plastics. Earlier this year, GRID-Arendal published the report, Climate Impacts of Plastics, to identify potential measures and strengthen governmental accountability, addressing this very important topic. We have analyzed reports submitted under the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement, and concluded that currently the plastic industry is integrated within the broader petrochemical and chemical industries. It limits the ability to specifically address plastic-related measures and integrates and poses challenges when we speak about interventions across the life cycle. We believe that such tools as nationally determined contributions and long-term low-emission development strategies can help close the plastic gap. To achieve this, countries should be equipped with necessary tools, starting with the financial mechanisms to support the transition from carbon-intense industries to low-carbon technologies. Additionally, there is a need to discuss methodologies and guidelines for practically improving accountability. Such guidelines would be instrumental in steering countries towards a transition to net zero emissions. As I mentioned, this is an energy-intense process, and starting reduction of greenhouse gases could be achieved through innovative technologies that promote the decarbonization of plastic production, emission reduction strategies, and energy efficiency. Plastic action is an integral part of climate action. Thank you very much, and floor back to you, Richard.
Thank you very much, Ieva. I now have the pleasure of inviting to the stage our three panelists. I'll introduce them one by one. First, we have Mr. Junichi Fuijino, Program Director of the Institute for Global Environmental Strategies in Japan. Welcome. Then we have Dan Koivulaakso, Head of Department for Growth and Climate in the Nordic Council of Ministers. And we have Al-Karim Govindji, who is the Global Head of Public Affairs of Energy Systems at DNV. I'll make some space, so perhaps one of you can also stand here. Thank you very much. And let me first ask Junichi if you have some intervention to make.
Yeah. Can you hear me? Yeah. Thank you very much for inviting me to this very interesting and very important panel. So I have three questions from the moderator. First one is the scientific evidence. So I'd like to show the latest trend that the plastic production is growing at an alarming rate, with no signs of slowing down. Current projection from the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory indicates that plastic production could reach up to 34 billion tons by 2050, driven by an annual growth rate of 5 to 3%. This would mean that plastic alone could consume up to 30% of the global carbon budget by 2050. No matter how much we promote the circular economy, unless we transition away from fossil-based plastics, it will not be enough to make a significant impact. We must change course now. We hope plastic becomes a dominant driver of climate change in the future. About the second question, confidence in science. We definitely need a life cycle approach. And it's important to implement policies that cover the full life cycle from upstream polymer production to downstream waste management. This means addressing not just production, but also consumption, recycling, and disposal. Also, we need to understand that cheap fossil-based plastic present major barriers to innovation and sustainability for ambitious companies trying to move forward. The low cost of fossil plastic undermines the investment these consumptions are making in developing new sustainable solutions. Another significant challenge is the differing regulation across countries, which creates insufficiencies and market fragmentation. We need to seek international common route based on the scientific evidence to reduce single-use plastics and other harmful practices. It is crucial that we raise the price of fossil plastics. This will make recycled materials and reuse business, which are currently expensive, much more competitive. And the third point, plastic industry. And I'd like to point out that reducing production volume is key, but we must also focus on the environmental conscious design, recycling, and reuse. Innovation in the material design, sustainable production process, and the scaling up of recycling and reuse system must go hand in hand. Right now, just less than 10% of materials are being recycled. Achieving our goal will require the cooperation and engagement of all stakeholders, government, business, and consumers. Recycling initiatives can generate a lot of synergy effects. For example, in the city of Kamakura in Japan, citizens collect used plastics, which is then upcycled into park benches using 3D printing technology by a team from Keio University. They are aiming to expand this project to create more products in the future. Kanazawa University team is working to replace petroleum-based plastic with bio-based alternatives using agricultural waste. Collaborating globally, they aim to reduce fossil fuel plastics and shift towards sustainable cellulose-based solutions. These projects are part of the program on Open Innovation Platform for Industry Academic Co-Creation, so-called CY Next by JST, Japan Science and Technology Agency, which supports the development of scientific and technological innovation in Japan. Last but not least, to further strengthen actions aimed to creating such synergies, IGES has been actively involved in developing the Global Climate and SDG Synergy Report 2023 and 2024, co-convened by UNDESA and UNFCCC. Looking ahead, we are not only supporting the production of the 2025 edition of the Global Report, but also working on a focus report specifically for the Asia-Pacific region, because IGES, we are particularly focused on coordinating regional solutions for plastic waste across East and Southeast Asia. To introduce these initiatives, we will be hosting a side event next Tuesday, so please come to Japan Pavilion at 11:45. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. If I can just summarize what you've just said, I understand that we have a problem, but technological innovation can go a long way in helping us address that problem. But at the same time, we probably also need, the economics to get it right, and we need the right policy incentives.
Yes.
We're going to have a discussion about that, but first let's hear how the Nordics are doing and how they approach sustainable production and consumption of plastics from Dan Koivulaakso, who is, as I said, Head of Department for Growth and Climate in the Nordic Council of Ministers.
Thank you. I am not sure if I will go into actually the production, but the limits we think that should be on production. But I think development of a binding global plastic instrument would be crucial. It's also a unique opportunity to strengthen global efforts in addressing climate change, also in regards to the 1.5 degree path that we should be on. Plastics make up 5% of global greenhouse gas emissions, and that is, of course, an extreme amount that we need to tackle. The Nordic Council of Ministers has worked for many years in building knowledge and capacity about how a global agreement on plastic could be framed, and we have also worked politically on it with, for example, 2 joint declarations by the Nordic Ministers of Environment over the last year in regards to this agreement. We also work very much in capacity building on this, on knowledge in the sense that we have financed, for example, a how to end plastic pollution by 2040 report, which sets out 15 different recommendations how this could be carried out, and this acts as a kind of framework for how a possible instrument and its decisions could be carried out in practice. There is basically 4 sets of tools that need to be applied for this. One is, of course, reduction of plastic, that regards also plastic. Then the other set is elimination, for example, the ban on single-use plastics. We have safe circularity and how we can reuse certain products, and then controlled disposal, of course, on how we should get rid of the plastics that is produced, and what for example, burning of that does. If we universally adopted and supported a common set of global rules with a legally binding instrument on plastic pollution, this could cut annual volumes of mismanaged plastic waste by 90%, and virgin plastic use by 30% by 2040, in relative to 2019 levels when this process started. So huge numbers here, and this would also have implications, of course, on the microplastics, which is something we all have to do within our everyday lives, because it's present in food we eat, or water we drink, or air we breathe. So 70% of microplastics reductions would follow from this plastic limitations. Yeah, we will. Over the next 6 years, the Nordic Council of Ministers will continue its work on environmental policy and in regards to plastic with a cooperation program we have just adopted, which also has ambitions to increase our work around plastics. But maybe I will end here, so we will have time for a discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dan. Before we go to Al-Karim, let's just look back very quickly to research, because I know the Nordic Council of Ministers wants to make sure that its policies are based on the best available knowledge, and you also support research. Can you give some examples of research in this area that you're interested in, or which you are supporting at the moment?
Yeah, you give me a good opportunity to refer back to what I just said, which is the How to End Plastic Pollution by 2040, which is a research report which then founds all its recommendation on research, and that is important for us at the Nordic Council of Ministers, that we, especially in regard to highly technical things such as productions and chemical use in plastic industry, are basing our policy recommendations on sound science and do not intervene with that. So one of our main ways of working is funding reports which are then used to formulate our policy based on them and based on best scientific knowledge that can be acquired. Thank you.
Great. You clearly advocated for a ban, a legally binding instrument that would ban, for example, single-use plastics. What is the economic case for that, and what does the private sector have to say? Let's hear from Al-Karim Govindji, Global Head of Public Affairs, the Energy Systems and DNV.
Yes, good afternoon. Good afternoon. Thank you, first of all, for inviting us to present here to both Nordic Council and to Arendal. So I'm not sure I'll go into the business case. I think there are many challenges to decarbonizing plastics. If we look at plastic pollution, we've talked about that it represents something like 5% of global emissions. And if you compare that with things like steel and cement, which are about 7-8%, it is a significant contributor to global emissions. And like those sectors, faces the same sorts of challenges around decarbonization. We also spoke and heard that 90%, 92% of the entire value chain emissions from plastics, of that, something like 7%, I think, comes from the actual extraction of the raw materials. So this is the methane that's emitted when the oil is extracted from the ground. And then the other 85% or so is happening from the refining process, as well as then the extruding process when you actually manufacture the plastics. So when you look at sort of solutions, perhaps around how you can reduce those aren't easy either. So we know from the oil and gas industry, there are challenges around reducing emissions, particularly the methane. But we've just had a signature yesterday, I think, in last COP. In fact, the Oil and Gas Decarbonization Charter had something like 50+ signatories, which represent about 40% of global oil production, who signed to achieve 2030 zero methane, as well as their net zero targets by 2050. So hopefully upstream of the plastics industry, and remember this is scope 3 for the plastics industry, right? It's not in their direct control because they're buying in raw materials. So there is, when you look at emissions within the plastics industry, you have to look at the upstream and downstream side and look at who's responsible for some of those emissions. And we'll come back to that in a second. So I think in terms of methane detection, in terms of eliminating flaring and venting, which are the kinds of things that the oil and gas industry is trying to do to eliminate that 7% of emissions, that type of stuff is starting to happen. There's more that needs to happen. There are satellites up there. There are drones that are being sent out to detect where the methane is coming out, to pinpoint which part of the pipelines are being affected, and so those fixes can be made on those pipelines. When you look at the actual production of plastics, Part of it, again, is upstream of the plastics industry. So when you look at refining, the products that the plastics industry uses are the monomers that come out from the oil and gas refining process. So again, it's the oil and gas companies that are doing the refining in their refining. They're doing the cracking, which is the heating of the crude oil into different layers and distillates. And it's that's causing the majority of the emissions upstream of the plastics industry. And so those monomers are put together with other monomers using catalysts to then develop the plastic through extrusion processes. The extrusion itself is actually done mainly through electricity. So as a solution for that, you can of course use renewables products, etc. But the raw material itself, we've talked about bioplastics, cellulose, starch, those sorts of products are alternatives to the use of classic oil and gas products. The challenge with bioplastics is manifold. One is they're much more expensive to produce. So again, like with other industries, to green your product is going to cost you a green premium. So that's the first problem. The second problem is they also have land issues. So you know, they have degradation issues. You could have deforestation. You could have food for fuel challenges when you're using land to produce these sorts of products. So there's competition there, which of course, particularly in the global south, is not something we always want to see. And then when it comes to waste, you have to have industrial composters to compost the plastics to eliminate future emissions to come out from that. Otherwise, you put it in landfill and you have the same issues as classic plastics, which is methane coming out from plastics, which are put into the ground. So none of these solutions are actually that straightforward when you look at the whole thing. CCUS, of course, is a technology we can start to use in terms of capturing some of the emissions in the refining process for the oil and gas industry, something, again, it is trying to think about. But again, in our kind of view, when we look at the 2050, where something like 270 million tons of CO2 will be captured in 2050, which is actually only 5% of global industrial emissions. Okay, this is all sectors, not just plastics. So it's not a huge amount. So again, CCUS is taking time, it's expensive, but there's more that needs to be done to try and support and develop that. Do you want me to go into some of the potential solutions and options?
Let's ask the audience. Yes.
Okay, I mean, on the first side, you know, we can look at policies to try and drive some of these things. And if you look at policies, they can come out in three types. There's market-driven policies. These are things like the emissions trading schemes. This is carbon pricing, things like that, where you put a price on carbon, you give companies allowances, as you all know. They hit that limit, and above that, they have to buy the credits. So that has been working well in Europe to try and get some of those emissions down. But it also relies on a good carbon price. Carbon price today in the EU is something like 60 euros per ton. UK is 40 pounds per ton. There's US is around the same sort of number. New Zealand is around $53. And China is around 8. So you see the carbon price is just not high enough to incentivize companies to actually make the change, even if they go above the allowances that they're permitted. So we need to drive those carbon prices much, much higher. And in our estimates, in our energy transition outlook, we say carbon price for the EU will be around $250 by 2050. So that's one part. Mandates, of course, is the second part. We've talked about single-use plastics that the EU already instigated, which has been very effective. I know in my own community, we've eliminated use of forks and plastic spoons, plastic plates, because they're not available. Retailers can no longer supply those products. So that's a good way of reducing the downstream demand. And I think that's something to think about when we look at the overall emissions within plastics industry. Tackling downstream demand is a huge impact on the upstream because you need far less product, especially if you start to do recycling and other things. So product standards is one great idea. Sectorial targets, so countries and regions having sectorial targets to try and reduce the emissions of a particular sector. The various countries have got sectoral targets. In China, for example, they've looked at eliminating something like 100 million tons of carbon from the manufacturing sector by 2030 to try and ensure, and that's being done through recycling. So they want to incentivize industry or force industry through a mandate to try and do that. And then, of course, there's financial incentives, right? The Inflation Reduction Act, which incentivizes production of green products, is another way you try and incentivize industry to reduce their emissions through a more of a pull or carrot rather than a stick. The other thing I'd say is maybe around innovation, funding innovations. The EU funds innovations, other countries fund innovations. The Department of Energy in the US is funding biodegradable plastics use. So those funding mechanisms can be another way that we can try and actually reduce emissions. I think an interesting one is extended producer responsibility. This is something that's been talked about, the World Plastics Council talked about. This is the idea that the responsibility of the entire value chain sits with the manufacturer. So they are responsible for collecting the plastic afterwards, for disposing of it, for dealing with the plastics throughout that life cycle. So that is being deployed now in Germany and South Korea as examples of ways to look at taking the ownership of the entire value chain, not just scope 1 and 2, but also scope 3. And finally, as I say, in terms of end demand, consumers and retailers can play a huge part in this space. So retailers are already reducing their plastics use in their products, eliminating use of plastic films on tops of yogurt bottles and other things. And of course, the end consumer, in terms of not demanding more plastic use in their products, or reusing items like bottles and things, of course, are other ways that we can try and deal with that.
Thank you very much. We'll go to the audience so you can think for about a minute or so of your question or your intervention if you'd like to contribute to the conversation, but Dan would also like to follow up.
Thank you. No, thank you for your insightful presentation. I just want to say that I mean you are probably right on what you are saying, but at the same time we should look at the emissions gap report, for example, that last year was the biggest emissions year ever, and plastics is well, now we're talking about plastics, we could talk about any other industry as well, so then we would talk about that industry. But if we do everything you said that is being done, that is still status quo unless we make new binding agreements that limit everywhere in the world what is being done about this. So everything that has been now done up until now is basically the status quo where we are right now. We need more than has ever been done before around this, and that should set the limits. Of course, we can have incentives within the limits, but first we need the limits, and then within that we can look at the incentives. I think this is something an important point that should be made, and now that it's crunch time and it's only 1 month up until the negotiations basically succeed or fail. And this is just a short point I wanted to make before we go on to audience. Thank you.
You can pass on the microphone. Yes. Oh, okay.
Thank you so much. I also would like to point it out that we also need to think about the triple planetary bound crisis. So the plastic, and then the climate, and also biodiversity, nature. Because plastic is so harmful to the animal. Or for example, we sometimes see the whales or the dolphins, their stomach full of plastic. It's quite shocking to the people, and then. Like Japanese people, some people join the beach cleaning activity for collecting the plastic rather than a carbon dioxide reduction activity. So how to motivate the people just not only by the logics, but also how we can have more activity, behavior change through the having the wide range of the perspective. Thank you.
Thank you. So we have a problem that is making the climate crisis worse. We have a need for policy because the solutions, even though they are there, are expensive and perhaps not that practical. Is a ban the solution? That's what we'll find out perhaps next month in Busan. Or is innovation another way of trying to break through this crisis? Or can the ban actually create the innovation that is necessary? Let me ask if in the audience there are any contributions or questions. Yes, please. And could you please introduce yourself with your name and affiliation?
Yes, Professor Matti Kuittinen, Aalto University, Finland. Thank you very much for a very interesting discussion. Probably you mentioned this, but I just missed it. So would you care to elaborate once again about the role of CO2-based plastics from DAC, direct air capture? So how do you see this evolving? You were talking about bio-based plastics and you were addressing that it has green premium and so forth. And I would just be curious, how do you see the future of CO2-based plastics? And then a small comment, I fully agree that there is the green premium problem, but that's actually a market failure in my view. So of course that's something that we should fix. It's not a force of nature, it's something that we can and should fix. But about CO2-based plastics, please.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, you're right that the green premium at the end of the day is a market failure because we're not accounting for the future impact or the future costs, right? We're not paying for that today. And so if that was accounted for and considering the future impacts of climate and the amount we will end up paying anyway, that should be built in the cost today. And then that cost needs to be allocated across the whole of the industry. But the other way to think about it is you can also create value from some of these things, right? There are opportunities for people to get value, whether it's around creation of new opportunities, new innovations, and all of those sorts of things. I can talk a little bit about direct air capture. I mean, in our kind of assessments, direct air capture can represent some part of the carbon elimination to 2050, but it's not going to play a huge part as a specific technology because it's expensive and the amounts that you capture are quite limited. I can't speak too much to CO2 related plastics. Maybe you can just explain a bit what you mean by.
Yeah, I was wondering about the use of CO2 as, the building block, a molecular building block of plastics. So is that a viable way? Because it's a theoretical option and it's not my, my field of science. That's why I'm asking you, the specialists, how do you see the evolution in the future?
Yeah. I wouldn't say I'm a specialist on that myself either, so you probably know more about this than myself.
Okay, maybe we have a specialist, yeah?
Not special, but we also need to think about the timber construction. We have a lot of the forest, and then sometimes, for example, Southeast Asia, they don't use the timber so well. They forget how to use sometimes. So then we also need to need the new technology. Timber is not so much fire-proven, and then also it's a sustainable, and also it's strong to the insect. And so then how to use such the new technology, what we already have in like Finland or in Japan, to these forest-rich country.
Thank you. Are there any other comments or questions? Yes, please.
First of all, thank you for all this important, really side event.
Could you briefly introduce yourself?
Yeah, for sure. So I am from Kazakhstan. My name is Dinara. So I also will be part of the delegation who will be during the upcoming negotiation process on the plastic in South Korea. So thank you for this side event. Actually, it's really important in the context of upcoming negotiation. And since we are talking about the innovation, so since I came from the the economy that is in the transition, and it actually for us really important. So we are kind of I guess say lack of the innovation or slow on the innovation. And my question for all the speakers actually, so how do you think the countries should actually better communicate for transfer this of the innovation? Right. So especially for the economy such as Kazakhstan.
That's a brilliant question. I'd like all three of you to reflect on that. We've got three people here from the global north, so to speak, from the rich part of the world. How can we support those countries that, like Kazakhstan, are in transition or require technology transfer and other forms of support to make the shift that is needed?
I mean, I think partly this is what COP is around, right? It's around ensuring that emerging economies have the same opportunities and to enable a just transition. So I think all the negotiations around the NCGQs, the loss and damage funds, all of these sorts of things, of course, are ways to try and support some of these countries. But I think around tech transfer, that's a really important one. There needs to be a much better and fairer way of transferring technologies that have been demonstrated in developed countries into developing countries. And I think policies, looking at policies that have worked in certain countries, and they're not all in the developed countries. Developing countries are also developing very useful policies. And I've talked a little bit about China, India, and some other markets have developed very good policies to drive innovation. But there are examples of innovation funding in many markets across Europe and the EU and the US around innovation funding, whether it's through specific collaborative projects that bring different parties together to drive to a solution, in this case around plastics, whether it's around specific technology, specific innovation that looks at each type of technology that can help to solve the problem. It can be innovation that can reduce the cost of those technology. It can be first-of-kind demonstration projects. So where there are projects that still need demonstrating and there aren't industrials who are willing to actually be the first case for that particular innovation, there's funding to allow that to happen, so then the rest of the industry has confidence in deploying some of those technologies. So I think there needs to be a gradual shift in some of those technologies into emerging markets.
Thank you.
At the right cost.
Thank you. First of all, I have to admit my limited knowledge of the economy of Kazakhstan, but I have to say that as the Nordic countries call for legally binding global plastics treaty, the Nordic countries, or some of the Nordic countries at least, are amongst the biggest development countries in the world, or development aid countries in the world. So that has always been an aspect of the Nordic countries to take into consideration. But more, I would like to focus on that this should of course be a part of an efficient treaty on what kind of economic implication it has for all the signatories of such a treaty. And as we look at international treaties, they affect and should affect everyone. Then also circumstances in various countries, also economic circumstances have to be taken in place. And that was of course the climate COP theme last year, and is an upcoming theme, the mitigation and how it should be carried out. So my answer to this is that it has of course to be an integral part of what is being agreed on in treaties, on how this the cost burden is shared on a macro level there. But going into technology again is sadly not in my field of expertise here.
My suggestion is that please do not follow Japanese style. We use so much plastics. Even though we can use traditional style of wrapping, we can use cloth or any style, any traditional the sustainable way, but we use so many plastics. So, and then we pay a lot for waste disposal of plastic. So please let's think that what is the country's future? What kind of plastic life or non-plastic life what you'd like to have? So social innovation is quite key to having your future, even though it may not so expensive the technology itself. But you may need good consensus, and then you may also need very good not only scientists but also who has a good communication with the society community, because everybody wants to use a simple way, easy way like a plastic. But this is the reason why we have too much plastic in Japan. So please do not follow us.
Yeah. Thank you. There's one more question. Let me just see if there are any other questions, because then this will be the last one. Okay. And please state your name and your affiliation.
Thank you, moderator. Satoru Mizuguchi, freelance journalist from Japan. The gentleman standing at the left, not the political terms, he elaborated the what kind of policies are necessary to make plastic transitions. My question is, aside from it's okay. Yeah, aside from policy requirements, what kind of industries are necessary to expand the niche market of bioplastics and or culture shift to make people more acceptable to the bioplastics. Thanks.
So if I understand your question, it was outside of policy, what can be done to help shift the plastics transition and to create some social impact or social acceptance? Yeah, I mean, one of the things I would say that the private sector does is joint industry projects. I think I touched upon this. So this is where you bring these private sector companies. It could be a manufacturer, it could be a technology developer, an innovator, a startup, potentially a financier or an investor who might be interested in this. So to bring, and sector associations, I think, play a huge part in this, right? Sector associations play this middle role between the private sector, who are often their members, as well as policymakers, who they often direct their recommendations to, right? So they play a crucial role, I think, in facilitating some of this stuff. So those sorts of projects to tackle some of these innovation challenges or gaps, I think are really important ways to try and drive, and the private sector can do this, and often is willing to pay for some of these things. The other thing around social acceptance, I'd say, is there's a lot of misunderstanding about things, right? Where are the emissions? People spend a lot of time on oceans, which has a different kind of emissions impacts to the upstream. We've heard where the emissions are, but of course has a big environmental impact. So I think there's a need to better educate the public in terms of what is causing what, in very simple terms, right? Because at the moment, I think some of these things get a little bit complicated, a little bit technical, and we need to ground all of this in something that is meaningful to the consumer and where they understand the impacts that these are having. Now, of course, they're feeling the impacts of climate every day. We've seen floods in Valencia, we've seen fires in different parts of the world, we've seen, also all these things which are clearly climate related, unless you're a climate denier. So the issue and the concern I have is that despite all of this, people are still not willing to make a consumption reduction, right? But a lot of the energy transition can be done with GDP growth, but through efficiency gain. So you can still continue to consume and reduce your emissions. You just have to do it with efficiencies and improvements and clean technologies.
Thank you so much. This is really a sneak preview of the negotiations that will be taking place in Busan in just a couple of weeks from now. And I really feel for those of us who need to be here and then also go to Busan. You're not going to the decertification COP as well in Riyadh after that one? I think there are some people who actually were in Cali for biodiversity and then here and then go to plastics and then go to Saudi Arabia. And long live multilateralism. I would really like to thank our three fantastic panelists and our speaker. Please join me in giving them a hand, and if I understand well, we will be now watching a short video. Thank you.
Did you know plastics cause climate change? Their production, use, and waste management emit greenhouse gases. As science evolves, we now know that global plastic production alone contributes up to 5.3% of total greenhouse gas emissions. With the Paris Agreement aiming to limit the rise of global temperatures to under 1.5 degrees Celsius, there's hope a new plastic treaty could help align our fight against plastic with our climate goals. GRID-Arendal's report, Climate Impact of Plastic, lays out actions we need to take. We can reduce our overall plastic production, design recyclable products, and reduce greenhouse gas emissions from waste management. In addition, the decarbonization of plastic production, by replacing fossil fuels with green energy sources, has great potential to reduce emissions. By tackling plastics, we're also fighting climate change. Let's make the world cleaner and cooler. Read our Climate Impact of Plastic report to learn more.